You are sitting in the wealthiest, most technologically advanced, most interconnected society
Yeah.
that has literally ever existed on the face of the earth. I mean, just look around you.
hmm
Global trade is humming, the stock market regularly hits record highs, and human knowledge is basically, doubling every few years. You look at all this, and it's completely natural to think, well, we have finally figured it out. But what if I told you that the absolute most dangerous phase of any complex society, like the precise moment where total collapse becomes mathematically inevitable, looks exactly like peak prosperity? Not the phase before the peak, not the decline after it. The prosperity itself is the trigger.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is that we're not talking about ideological politics, and we're certainly not talking about doomsday prophecies. If we, strip away the emotion, we are looking at the cold, hard math of historical cycles, thermodynamics, and systems dynamics. Today, our goal for this deep dive is to explore a really fascinating synthesis of 5 independent mathematical and historical frameworks that explain exactly why prosperity triggers collapse. And then we're going to look impartially at how 2 completely different global operating systems, so the Western nation states, specifically the U.S., and the Eastern civilization states, specifically China, are structurally engineered to face this incoming mathematical cliff.
Right. Okay, so to understand how massive modern superpowers might actually fail, we first have to unpack the mathematical engines of historical collapse. And the framework that really kicks this off comes from a researcher named Peter Turchin. He tracks something he calls the wealth pump. So Turchin looked at, I think it was like 5,000 years of historical data, and he found this relentless pattern. Economic prosperity naturally concentrates wealth at the top, and this concentration causes 2 major structural fractures. First, you get popular immiseration, which just means, ordinary wages stagnate and life gets harder for the average person. Second, and apparently way more dangerous, is elite overproduction.
Yeah, elite overproduction is really the critical mechanism here. It's what happens when a system produces, well, far more highly educated, credentialed elites than there are actual positions of power or prestige available for them to occupy.
Let me put a real world number on that, actually. Right
Yeah.
now, U.S. law schools produce roughly 25,000 surplus lawyers every single year.
Wow.
Every year. Every year. So you have all these people who did exactly what society asked. They got the degrees, they took on massive 6-figure debt, they expect the comfortable career the system promised them, but the corner offices are full. Turton's math shows that these highly educated, deeply frustrated individuals don't just quietly accept their fate. They become what he calls counter-elites. They use their education to channel the anger of the general public, and eventually they tear the political system apart from the inside.
Exactly. And that's just looking at the sociological pressure cooker, right? We also have to layer in Joseph Tainter's archaeological framework, known as the complexity trap, which shifts us from sociology into pure thermodynamics. Tainter argues that human societies are, at their core, just problem-solving organizations. Whenever we face a problem, we solve it by adding a layer of complexity. We create a new law, a new layer of middle management, a new technology, a new regulatory body.
Right, which makes sense. I mean, that's how civilization advances.
It is. And early on, it works brilliantly, but here is the trap. Complexity is incredibly expensive to maintain. Eventually, the sheer energy and economic costs of just managing that accumulated complexity, it consumes the society's entire surplus margin.
Okay, and this is where we get into ERY, right? Energy return on investment. Because this really clicked for me when I saw the historical comparison in the sources. Think about it this way. A century ago, the EROI for American oil was about 100 to 1. That means you burned 1 barrel of oil's worth of energy to drill a well, and you got 100 barrels back. Those 99 free surplus barrels are what built the interstate highway system, they funded universities, put a man on the moon, and invented the internet. But today, that ratio has dropped to nearly 5 to 1.
Precisely. It's a massive drop. At 5 to 1, a society is spending almost all of its energy just hunting for and extracting more energy. When a society loses that massive surplus, it becomes rigid. It becomes completely brittle. It literally does not have the extra energy laying around to absorb outside shocks, whether that's, a global pandemic, a massive drought, or a financial crisis. The complexity that originally saved the society becomes the sheer weight that crushes it.
Wait, hold on. Let me push back here for a second because I'm looking at my retirement account and the market is at an all-time high. GDP is growing. If the math from Turchin says our social fabric is tearing and Tainter's thermodynamics say we are totally out of energy surplus, well, why is Wall Street throwing a party? It doesn't make sense to me that the top-level indicators would flash green if we're driving off a cliff.
I get that. But that paradox is exactly what the Handy model explains. This was a model developed by Safa Moshareh and actually funded by NASA. It proved mathematically that economic stratification alone can cause total civilizational collapse, even if resources are totally abundant.
Wait, even with abundant resources?
Yes, because the elites are buffered from the daily reality, they insulate themselves from the declining conditions of the commoners.
Yeah.
Therefore, the aggregate wealth of the society continues to climb right up to the absolute point of systemic failure. And it's worth noting, NASA quickly rushed to publicly distance themselves from the study because the implications were so deeply uncomfortable.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's like a hamster on a wheel. We are running faster and faster just to maintain the exact same position, spending more energy to extract less. I mean, treating opioid addiction, repairing crumbling infrastructure after endless storms, filing insanely complex taxes, all of that generates economic activity, right? It looks like growth on a spreadsheet, but it's actually structural exhaustion.
That's spot on. Economic historians call this false prosperity. Consider the Ming Dynasty in China as the perfect historical parallel here. In the late 1500s, there was this massive influx of silver pouring in from the Americas and Japan. On paper, the Ming economy looked incredibly wealthy. Trade was booming, and tax revenues, which were now demanded in silver, skyrocketed.
So everyone thought they were rich.
Right, but the silver wasn't creating any underlying tangible productivity. It wasn't growing more grain or building better plows. It was just lubricating exchange and shifting a massive tax burden onto the peasant farmers.
So the wealth was an illusion.
Completely. Yeah. When the silver inflows suddenly stopped in the 1630s due to global trade shifts, the entire dynasty collapsed within a decade. It's a crucial lesson. GDP and monetary metrics measure friction and activity. They do not measure structural health, physical resilience, or actual survival capacity.
And what's really terrifying is the timeline for all this. The sources mention a corporate data analyst at KPMG who recently tested the famous World 3 model. Now, this was a computer model from 1972 that predicted the limits to global growth, and honestly, economists mocked it for 50 years. But this analyst took 50 years of actual real-world global data and laid it over the model.
It matched up.
It is tracking almost perfectly, and the scenario it's tracking predicts a steep halt and decline in global industrial output setting in right around the year 2040. So, we aren't talking about a distant theory, it's approaching fast. Which brings us to how different global operating systems are actually reacting to this incoming pressure. Let's look at the Western model, specifically the United States. The analysis suggests the U.S. has morphed into what it calls a hybrid dystopia.
Yes. When you look closely at the data and structural behaviors, the current U.S. model operates like a fusion of George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. From the Orwellian side, you have a system that fundamentally relies on a perpetual war economy. It burns through immense physical resources to maintain an overextended global military footprint, and it funds that footprint through compounding unpayable debt and the abstract printing of fiat money.
But you can't just run a war machine and inflate the currency without the public eventually revolting, which is exactly where the Huxleyan side comes in. To keep the domestic population compliant while their actual physical purchasing power erodes, the system applies what the sources call digital soma. I mean, if you are listening to this deep dive on a smartphone right now, you are literally holding it. It's the high-frequency, frictionless digital entertainment, the algorithmic outrage loops, the endless social media distraction. The system essentially balances extreme financial precarity with infinite, incredibly cheap amusement. But, looking at how the Western financial system actually operates, it feels less like a dystopia and more like a giant absentee landlord.
An absentee landlord. Unpack that for me.
Well, think about how private equity firms operate right now. They buy up productive, generational companies that actually make things. Then they saddle those companies with massive debt, strip all the physical assets, extract the cash to pay their own dividends, and just leave the hollowed-out shell of the company to go bankrupt. They are extracting massive financial value without actually building any tangible physical infrastructure. It's entirely paper chemistry.
Yeah, that absentee landlord analogy hits the absolute core of the problem. But we have to ask why the system allows this. Why doesn't the government just step in and stop the wealth pump from hollowing out the country?
Right.
Well, the analysis argues that the Western system cannot reform itself because the very institutions required to fix the problem are entirely captured by the financial elites who profit from it. And on a deeper level, the foundational Enlightenment ideology of the West, so hyper-individualism, absolute free expression, and laissez-faire free markets, It explicitly forbids the central state from acquiring the authority needed to override the free market.
Oh man, so the system is mathematically paralyzed by its own foundational values. It literally cannot stop the financial elites from getting the industrial base without violating its own constitutional principles. Okay, so if the West is constitutionally trapped and can't stop this wealth pump, has anyone else figured out a loophole? Because you have civilizations operating on multi-millennia timelines. How do they look at this exact same math? Let's talk about China and the concept of the Eastern civilizational fortress.
To understand the Chinese response, we have to completely discard our standard Western frameworks of 20th century capitalism versus communism. China operates on a civilization state model governed by a deep institutional memory. Specifically, they utilize a social framework known as the Four Occupations, which dates back thousands of years. This system organizes society not by wealth, but by a group's contribution to collective stability.
Right, the four occupations. So at the top, you have the Shi, the scholars and administrators. Below them are the Nong, the peasant farmers who produce the food that keeps everyone alive. Then the Gong, the artisans and engineers who build tangible things like tools and infrastructure. And firmly at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy, you have the Sheng, the merchants, the traders, and the financial speculators.
Historically, Chinese dynasties viewed the Shang class with profound suspicion. Because merchant wealth is entirely liquid and mobile, speculators have the power to hoard vital resources, manipulate market prices, and plunge an entire empire into famine and chaos just to turn a profit. The lesson ingrained in Chinese statecraft over 3 millennia is that speculative greed is a direct existential threat to civilizational survival.
And the fascinating thing is that hierarchy isn't just history, it's alive and well today. The Chinese Communist Party essentially acts as the modern Xi class, the administrative elite. And they forcefully keep the modern Shang class, the tech billionaires, the venture capitalists, the financial speculators, on a very tight leash. Capital is simply not allowed to capture the state. I like to visualize the Chinese system like a human body. The brain, the Xi administrators, absolutely refuses to let the stomach's endless appetite, the Shang financial speculators, dictate where the body walks.
That's a highly illustrative way to look at it. We see this play out in real time. When real estate conglomerates become dangerously over-leveraged, or when tech monopolies like Ant Group threaten to create an unregulated parallel financial system, the state aggressively steps in and pops its own economic bubble.
They just pop them on purpose?
Yes. Through policies like the 3 red lines restricting debt and under the banner of common prosperity. The brain overrides the stomach to protect the collective health of the entire body. If we connect this to the bigger picture, China fundamentally values tangible, physical wealth over the West's abstract paper derivatives.
Exactly. While the West is trading derivatives, China is measuring actual wealth in metric tons of steel produced, kilometers of high-speed rail laid down, and securing hard commodities across the globe through the Belt and Road Initiative. But here's the catch. Controlling the financial elites might solve Peter Turchin's wealth pump and prevent elite overproduction. But it does absolutely nothing to solve the laws of physics.
Right.
China consumed an unprecedented amount of coal, iron, and concrete to build all that physical wealth. If they keep growing exponentially, they will hit the exact same thermodynamic ceiling predicted by the 2040 limits to growth. So how do they escape the energy cliff?
You've hit on the ultimate bottleneck, thermodynamics. And China's administrative state is acutely aware of this ticking energy clock. To avoid a finite time resource singularity, meaning running completely out of the energy needed to run their society, they are employing what they call a whole-of-nation system. The state is forcefully directing massive amounts of capital away from consumer apps and speculative crypto assets and directly into deep tech hardware. They're desperately trying to achieve a qualitative shift in energy density.
And the centerpiece of that survival strategy is their aggressive pursuit of generation level fission, specifically thorium molten salt reactors, or TMSRs. This part of the research completely blew my mind. First, thorium is roughly 3 to 4 times more abundant than uranium, and China sits on massive reserves of it because it's a natural byproduct of their rare earth mining. But the real game changer is the reactor design itself. Instead of using highly pressurized water for cooling, these reactors use liquid fluoride salt.
The geopolitical and safety implications of that switch from water to molten salt are massive. Conventional nuclear plants require immense amounts of water, meaning they have to be built near coastlines or major rivers, which makes them ecologically vulnerable to tsunamis and geopolitically vulnerable to naval blockades. Furthermore, if a traditional water-cooled reactor loses power, the water boils off, pressure builds, and you get a catastrophic meltdown.
But with the molten salt,
With TMSRs, if the power fails, a frozen plug melts, and the liquid salt simply drains into a holding tank and naturally solidifies into a rock. No explosion, no meltdown.
that is just incredible. And because they don't need water, TMSRs can be built right in the middle of the arid Gobi Desert. Plus, they can be refueled continuously without shutting down the grid, and they drastically slash long-term radioactive waste.
And they aren't even stopping a thorium fission. They are concurrently engineering nuclear fusion, with State directives aiming to light a net power fusion lamp by 2030. They are literally designing entire fusion cities from the ground up to mass-produce modular reactors at a factory scale.
The contrast here is just staggering. In the West, venture capital throws billions at social media algorithms because they yield quick paper returns in a 90-day corporate quarter. Meanwhile, the Chinese state is forcing investment into multi-decade nuclear grids. It's like watching one person plant a generational apple orchard while the other person is aggressively day trading fruit.
That long-term horizon is their primary civilizational defense mechanism. Their timeline aligns perfectly with that World 3 model's 2040 collapse horizon we discussed earlier. Because their system operates in decades and centuries rather than 2 to 4 year election cycles, they're racing to establish a high enough energy return on investment, a massive thermodynamic surplus, to essentially jump clean off the planetary fossil fuel grid before global resources deplete and trigger a systemic crisis.
Okay, so this brings us to the ultimate clash. If the East is anchoring itself in physical autarky, tangible infrastructure, and advanced high-density energy, and the West is doubling down on abstract financialization, consumer distraction, and compounding debt, what happens when that 2040 mathematical cliff actually hits? The research describes the outcome as a scissor bifurcation splitting the world.
Yes, a scissor bifurcation means the paths of these two systems will sharply diverge and permanently separate. The West, driven by its deeply ingrained Enlightenment ideals, will almost certainly not adopt the Chinese top-down command and control model smoothly. For Western citizens to suddenly abandon hyper-individualism and free markets in favor of strict, state-mandated resource rationing, well, that would be viewed as ideological suicide. So when the federal debt walls finally hit their mathematical limit and the energy margins drop below the level needed to maintain our complex systems, the central fiat illusion will break. The models predict this will lead to a centrifugal dissolution.
Wait, centrifugal dissolution. So imagine a spinning centrifuge pulling things apart from the center, meaning the federal government essentially loses its grip and the country fractures outward into regional pockets.
Exactly. As the central apparatus fails to provide basic infrastructure or economic stability, distinct geographic and economic regions will simply stop sending their tangible resources to bail out a bankrupt central capital. They will split into decentralized regional survival enclaves, likely clustering together based on shared ideological affinity.
So what does this all mean for us? It's like a giant, heavily leveraged corporate conglomerate being forced into bankruptcy and breaking up into localized mom-and-pop survival shops.
That's a very grounded way to look at it. But those newly formed mom-and-pop survival shops will immediately run into a harsh, unforgiving physical reality. You cannot power an electrical grid or secure a physical supply chain with philosophy, debate, and raw individualism. To survive the severe energy deficit, these larger, ambitious Western enclaves will be forced to adapt structurally. To manage their crumbling infrastructure, they will likely have to adopt a form of technocratic meritocracy, essentially evolving their own Western version of the Chinese Xi administrative class.
And because the West spent the last few decades optimizing smartphone apps instead of energy grids, these enclaves won't have the capital or the time to invent next-generation energy from scratch. So they will be forced to import those mass-produced modular Chinese thorium reactors and fusion components. Meaning, to survive, these fragmented Western enclaves will effectively become customer states, plugging directly into the Eastern civilizational grid.
It is the ultimate historical irony. The West has long assumed its ideology of individual liberty and free markets was the final universal destination for all human progress. But in the deep, long-term theater of history, thermodynamics and the absolute requirement for collective order will always outlast the short-term luxury of absolute individual expression.
Okay, let's bring this all together. We started by looking at a profound paradox, how prosperity itself generates the complexity and wealth concentration that inevitably destroys complex societies. Looking impartially at the mathematical and historical models, we see that while the West is currently masking its structural decline with compounding debt and the digital distraction of our smartphones, civilization states are utilizing deep time, institutional memory, and hard physics to build tangible survival fortresses.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought, moving from the macro-civilizational scale down to your own personal life. Think about your daily routine and the way you manage your own resources, your time, and your attention. Are you living your life like a highly leveraged Western nation-state? Are you addicted to the short-term digital soma of endless notifications, carrying debt to fund immediate consumption, and chasing speculative, quick-fix gains? Or are you actively building a personal civilizational fortress? Are you investing your energy into tangible skills, deep-time relationships, and physical resilience that can actually withstand a systemic shock?
Because at the end of the day, the math of collapse doesn't just apply to ancient empires or modern superpowers. It applies directly to us as individuals, too. It is perfectly possible to look around your life and feel like you are at the absolute peak of your own personal prosperity, while the underlying math says your margin is already completely on.
Exactly. The warning signs of a collapse are rarely a sudden explosive crash. They are the quiet, invisible erosion of your surplus energy, happening while everything on the surface still looks perfectly fine.
Just like an archaeological find we see in the ruins of the ancient city of Ugarit. Archaeologists found an unbaked clay letter in the ruins. The king was writing that everything was prospering, his wealth was vast, his markets were full, and his ships were deployed all over the known world. But by the time he could physically see the actual threat of collapse on the horizon, the immense complexity that made him rich made it absolutely impossible to move out of the way. We will leave you with that to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.